The 80s produced some of the most unfairly savaged films in Hollywood history, and the critics who did it have never really had to answer for it. These are the films they declared worthless on arrival, the ones audiences refused to let die, and the ones that proved the critics wrong without ever asking permission. Red Dawn arrived in the summer of 1984, carrying a fear that an entire generation of American teenagers already knew by name. John Milius sent Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, and Jennifer Grey to an 8-week CIA-run boot camp in the New Mexico mountains where they were hunted by their instructors at night, and you can see every hour of it in their faces. Critics called it a fantasy, but what Milius actually built is a film where most of the heroes are dead by the end, and the scene where Swayze executes a wounded, terrified enemy soldier up close is one of the ugliest moments in any 80s action film because Milius shoots it like the crime it is. The Guinness Book of Records declared it the most violent film ever made, at roughly 2.23 acts of violence per minute. The Washington Post called it fascist, and Milius reportedly told the Los Angeles Times the same year that he made it as an anti-war film, hoping that if both sides could see it, maybe it wouldn't have to happen. Young men who saw it enlisted within 2 years, and 40 years later, people still cannot agree on what it was trying to say, which might be the most honest thing about it. Iron Eagle is about a teenager so desperate to save his father from a foreign prison that he steals 2 military fighter jets and flies alone into enemy territory with nothing but a cassette player taped to his thigh and enough nerve to make up for everything else. Critics called it stupid, while every kid who saw it understood exactly what he was doing and why. The U.S. Air Force refused to cooperate because the plot required stealing military aircraft, so the production moved to Israel, where the Israeli Air Force rented them actual F-16 fighter jets and provided combat pilots for the aerial sequences, which is either the most efficient casting decision of the decade or a sign that somebody at the Israeli Defense Ministry had a sense of humor. Director Sidney Furie shoots the dogfights with a ground-level desperation that American military cooperation would have sanitized into something cleaner and less frightening, and the authenticity comes entirely from the fact that the planes, the pilots, and the explosions were all real. Critics used Top Gun's release 4 months later to declare Iron Eagle a cheap imitation of a film that had not yet been released when Iron Eagle finished shooting. It earned roughly $24 million on an $18 million budget, and the home video revenue eventually greenlit 3 sequels for a film the industry had already written off as a failure. Roger Ebert gave Mannequin 0 stars and called it an insult to the intelligence of a mannequin. It also completely failed to account for the fact that the film was designed by market research data rather than artistic instinct, knew exactly what it was doing, and somehow proceeded to earn roughly $42 million against a $7 million budget by doing it. Jonathan is a struggling artist who discovers the mannequin he built is actually an ancient Egyptian princess who only comes to life when he is the only person watching. The film understands that a man whose only real relationship is with someone nobody else can see is either the loneliest premise in 80s cinema or the most romantic, depending on how much you are willing to trust him. Kim Cattrall spent up to 12 hours a day holding contorted poses without moving, underwent hours of full-body makeup to achieve a plastic-like skin texture, and trained with a professional statue performer to learn how to breathe without being visible, and the crew reportedly forgot she was real during lighting setups and left her standing in the window displays. The production filmed exclusively between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. inside the Real Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, and because they never had to account for daylight, the cinematographers built a world entirely out of neon and shadow that made the store look like a place where an Egyptian princess coming back to life was the most reasonable thing happening. Critics called it artificial, and the film they declared brain dead knocked Sylvester Stallone out of the box office rankings the week it opened, proving the market research knew exactly what it was doing. Before Michael J. Fox became the clean-cut hero of Back to the Future, he spent weeks in a genuinely decaying Toronto high school playing a trumpet player, being systematically destroyed by a gang of neo-punk sociopaths. The experience was reportedly unpleasant enough that he described the set as aggressive in a way that no Family Ties episode had prepared him for. Class of 1984 follows an idealistic music teacher who arrives at a school ruled by a brilliant, affluent gang leader. He spends the film discovering that his belief in education as transformation has no purchase in an environment where the students are more organized and more ruthless than the institution trying to contain them. Director Mark Lester shoots the school with the documentary grittiness, filming in real high-crime areas with actual local punks as extras, and the craft is in how he refuses to let the film become a simple revenge fantasy until the teacher has been stripped of every other option. The British censors labeled it a video nasty, cut roughly 4 minutes and 14 seconds, and it took 23 years for the uncut version to receive an official UK release. That is a long time to wait for a film where the students were fictional, but the schools that inspired them were not. Rob Bottin was just 22 years old when he took on The Thing and moved on to the Universal backlot. He somehow did not leave for over a year, working roughly 20-hour days until his body finally gave out, and he was hospitalized with double pneumonia, a bleeding ulcer, and exhaustion so severe he required weeks of medical care to recover. The film follows a group of Antarctic researchers who discover a shape-shifting alien organism in their sled dog. Macready, the cynical helicopter pilot Kurt Russell plays, is not trying to save anyone so much as trying to figure out who is still worth saving, which turns out to be the same problem. Carpenter shoots the isolation with a claustrophobic patience that lets the dread build through long silences, refusing to give the audience a safe character to root for, because the whole point is that nobody is safe and nobody can be verified. The New York Times called it instant junk. The failure cost Carpenter his deal with Universal, and the effects work that the studio tried to cut, and the critics called disgusting, has never been surpassed in roughly 30 years of technological advancement. The Wraith is about a dead man who comes back as a ghost in a supernatural black supercar to pick off the gang that killed him one by one. The reason it still lands is not the special effects or the soundtrack, but the specific satisfaction of watching someone the system completely failed finally get to settle the score on his own terms. The film is set in an Arizona desert town where a gang of road pirates has been terrorizing locals for years with total impunity. The Wraith does not argue with that system or expose it or appeal to it. He simply shows up and starts winning, which is a fantasy critics called lazy and audiences found genuinely cathartic. Marvin shoots the desert sequences with a neon-drenched MTV energy that makes the landscape feel less like a location and more like a place specifically designed for someone to come back from the dead and take what they are owed. An assistant cameraman named Bruce Ingram died when a camera car flipped during a high-speed chase sequence outside Tucson, and director Mike Marvin somehow completed the remaining car stunts in just 8 days instead of 3 weeks, finishing a film the credits dedicated to Ingram's memory while critics were busy calling it shallow. Cannon Films handed to B. Hooper roughly $25 million to make what they called a Star Wars-level event. What he delivered starred an 18-year-old French actress who spoke almost no English, spent nearly her entire screen time completely nude in front of hundreds of crew members in cold London studios, and single-handedly convinced the British government that a naked space vampire draining the city's life energy was something they needed to respond to with polite institutional paralysis. Janet Maslin of the New York Times summarized it as hysterical vampire porn. The astronaut who survives the initial encounter develops a psychic link to the space vampire that is equal parts terror and compulsion. Steve Railsback plays him as a man so completely colonized by something he cannot name that the question of whether he wants to stop her or find her becomes genuinely impossible to answer. Hooper shoots the London apocalypse sequences with a genuine blockbuster scale that Cannon's money made possible and that no other director in their stable would have known how to spend. He uses the city itself as a character that slowly empties out, and the craft is in how the film keeps treating its own insanity with total sincerity, never winking, never pulling back. It earned roughly $11 million against a $25 million budget. The disaster contributed directly to the financial collapse that eventually bankrupted Cannon Films, and the film that critics called too silly to take seriously has somehow spent 40 years being taken very seriously by everyone who understands what Hooper was attempting. Gene Siskel called Patrick Swayze's performance in Roadhouse mindless posturing and accused him of selling himself to become a pinup boy. That is one of the more aggressively wrong critical takes of the decade, given that Swayze had trained for months in kickboxing and aikido, cracked his ribs during filming, and walked away with a permanent knee injury from a scene he reportedly refused to let a stunt double perform. Dalton is a professional bouncer with a philosophy degree from NYU who gets hired to clean up the most dangerous bar in Missouri and ends up in a small-town insurgency against a crime lord who owns the entire county. The film is most alive in the gap between how seriously it takes its own absurdity and how little it apologizes for any of it. Director Rowdy Harrington built the Double Deuce bar from scratch for roughly $1 million specifically to destroy it, shooting the monster truck sequence in wide shots with no camera tricks because the whole premise of the production was that everything you see is actually happening. The film earned 5 Razzie nominations, grossed roughly $30 million on a $15 million budget, and was declared a monument to gratuitous mayhem by critics who had clearly never spent a weekend watching it on basic cable with a room full of people who had memorized every line. The producer of Tuff Turf later admitted that if he had known the full extent of Robert Downey Jr. and Kim Richards' substance abuse problems during the shoot, he probably would never have cast them, which is an honest thing to say about a film where the chaos on screen and the chaos behind it were essentially the same thing. Morgan is a preppy outsider who moves from Connecticut to a rough Los Angeles neighborhood, falls for the girlfriend of a local gang leader, and spends the film trying to prove he belongs somewhere he clearly does not, and James Spader plays him with a simmering arrogance that makes every confrontation feel less like self-defense and more like a man looking for a reason. Spader reportedly refused to socialize with the actors playing the gang members throughout the entire shoot, maintaining a genuine distance and condescension that created real animosity on set. And the physical confrontations between them became uncomfortably real during the bicycle chase through Reseda. The studio nearly shut the production down before a single frame was shot, because Streets of Fire had just collapsed at the box office with a similar neon and rock aesthetic, forcing the producer to fight the board to keep the film alive on a brutal 4-week schedule. It grossed around $9 million. Critics called the scene where Spader performs a song in a club laughable, and the failure nearly ended the director's career before it started, which is a strange outcome for a film that basically invented the James Spader we all eventually got. Critics destroyed Heaven's Gate so completely after its New York premiere that United Artists pulled it from theaters after just 1 week. Most of America never got the chance to decide for themselves before the verdict was handed down, which is how a film that took 4 years to make lasted roughly 4 days in cinemas. Heaven's Gate follows a Harvard-educated federal marshal in 1890s Wyoming who watches cattle barons hire mercenaries to massacre a list of 125 immigrant settlers. Jim Averill is the kind of man who had every advantage the country offered and chose to spend it standing between the people who built America and the people who owned it, which is exactly the kind of moral position critics in 1980 found confusing and audiences today find devastating. Cimino shoots the immigrant community with a warmth and physical specificity that makes the violence against them feel genuinely catastrophic rather than cinematic, using long takes and natural light to build a world the audience actually grieves when it gets destroyed. He reportedly ordered an entire period-accurate street torn down and rebuilt because it was 2 inches too narrow, pushing the budget from $11 million to $44 million and bankrupting United Artists entirely. The Criterion Collection released it decades later to near-universal reassessment as a masterpiece, proving the critics who declared it dead were just early.